The disappearance of Susan Cox and the tragic events that followed unravel as one of the most chilling and heart-wrenching family sagas in modern history. Susan Cox was born on October 16, 1981, in Puyallup, Washington, where she was raised in a loving and close-knit family. Described as bubbly, kind-hearted, and ambitious, she radiated positivity, and her friendly demeanor made her well-liked by those around her. Susan had big dreams of a bright future, and her goal was to build a life centered around family and happiness. Her optimism and determination were evident in the way she approached life, always with a smile and an infectious enthusiasm. In 2001, Susan met Joshua Powell, a young man she initially found charming and attentive. At first glance, Joshua seemed like the perfect match for Susan. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemed to share similar values. Their connection was immediate, and within a short period, they began dating seriously. The couple married in 2001, embarking on what Susan hoped would be a lifetime of love and partnership. They settled in West Valley City, Utah, where Susan began to create the family she had always dreamed of. In 2005, they welcomed their first son, Charles, and 2 years later, their second son, Braden, was born in 2007. As a mother, Susan was devoted to her children, and despite any challenges she faced in her marriage, she remained focused on providing a stable and loving environment for her boys. The small family seemed to be living a typical suburban life, but behind the scenes, Susan's marriage began to show signs of strain. Joshua, who had appeared to be the ideal partner at first, began to exhibit increasingly controlling and erratic behavior. Friends and family members later shared that Susan had confided in them about her growing concerns for her safety and well-being. Despite these red flags, Susan remained hopeful that their issues could be resolved, all while continuing to nurture her children and her career. Susan's ambition and drive, however, did not go unnoticed. Even though her personal life was becoming more complicated, she remained determined to succeed in all areas of life, whether it was in her role as a mother or her professional pursuits. Her positive attitude and desire to create a fulfilling life for her family defined her during her early adulthood, and her tragic disappearance would later shed light on the darker, hidden struggles within her marriage. Joshua Powell's father, Susan Powell, was a source of significant discomfort and distress for Susan. Over time, Susan began to feel increasingly uncomfortable around Stephen due to his inappropriate behavior and actions. He reportedly made unsettling comments about Susan's appearance, and she began to fear his advances. Despite her growing discomfort, Susan continued to be polite and respectful, but privately, she became more wary of his presence. Susan Powell's behavior escalated, leading Susan to discuss her concerns with her friends and family. She described how his harassment made her feel uneasy, especially when it came to his intrusive and inappropriate actions. Susan's unease with Stephen's behavior was another strain in her already difficult marriage, as Joshua failed to acknowledge or address his father's troubling conduct, leaving Susan to deal with the harassment on her own. This added layer of tension further complicated the already fragile dynamics within the Powell family. On the morning of December 6, 2009, Susan Cox Powell attended church with her family, a routine that was common for the Powell family. Susan, always dedicated to her children, ensured that they were well prepared for the service, and the day seemed to begin like any other. She appeared to be in good spirits, interacting with those around her, and there was no indication that anything was amiss. After church, Susan returned home with her 2 young sons, Charles and Braden, and spent the afternoon at the family's West Valley City home. Later that day, a neighbor who had known the Powells for some time stopped by their home for a brief visit. The neighbor later reported that everything seemed normal, with no signs of distress or unusual behavior. The house appeared undisturbed, and Susan's demeanor was said to be calm and collected. The children were playing, and there was nothing to suggest that Susan was in danger or planning to leave her family behind. After the visit, the neighbor left, and Susan was last seen in her home, engaged in the normal routines of family life. However, this would tragically be the last time anyone outside her household would see Susan alive. By the evening, Susan had vanished without a trace. Her husband, Joshua Powell, claimed that she had gone missing sometime overnight, but there was no evidence to support this story. Despite the apparent normalcy of the day, Susan's disappearance would soon become the subject of intense investigation, revealing that things were far from what they had seemed on the surface. The events of that day marked the beginning of an agonizing mystery that would unfold in the weeks and months that followed. At first, relatives reported the entire Powell family missing on December 7, 2009. Joshua's mother, Terica, and his estranged sister, Jennifer Graves, became concerned when they were informed that the children had not been dropped off at daycare that morning. They immediately went to the Powell home to check on the family but were unable to make contact with either Joshua or Susan. After trying to reach them without success, they called the police. Upon arriving at the house, the police were initially concerned that the family might be victims of carbon monoxide poisoning, as there were no signs of life and no one answered the door. They forced entry into the house, but they found it empty. However, they noticed two box fans blowing on a wet spot on the couch, which struck them as unusual. There were no immediate signs of foul play, but the situation was becoming increasingly perplexing. Later, it was confirmed that Susan had not shown up at her job on December 7, further raising suspicions about her disappearance. Inside the house, Susan's purse, wallet, and identification were all found, but there was no sign of her. To make matters more perplexing, her cell phone was later discovered in the family's only vehicle, a Chrysler Town and Country minivan, that Joshua had been using. The discovery of these personal items, along with the absence of Susan and her children, deepened the mystery surrounding the family's disappearance. Later that day, around 5 p.m., Joshua returned home with his two sons and was taken to the police station for questioning. He told authorities that he had left Susan sleeping at home just after midnight on December 7 and then took his children on a camping trip to the Pony Express Trail in western Utah. Police went to the area on December 10 but found no trace of the campsite Joshua had described. They also found it suspicious that Joshua would have taken his young children camping in blizzard conditions so late at night, especially when they were scheduled to go to daycare just hours later. Additionally, Joshua had not informed his boss that he would miss work that day, claiming he thought it was Sunday instead of Monday. After a second round of questioning on the evening of December 8, Joshua rented a car from Salt Lake City International Airport. His movements after leaving the airport remain unclear. Approximately 18 hours later, at around 4 p.m. on December 9, he called his mother from a new phone while driving south on Interstate 84 near Tremonton, heading towards Salt Lake City. He later told his sister, Jennifer Graves, that he had been aimlessly driving around the city, randomly getting on and off freeways. Investigators later discovered that Joshua had added an additional 807 miles to the rental car's odometer during this time. On December 9, 2009, investigators conducted a search of the Powell residence and discovered several alarming items. They found traces of Susan's blood on the floor, life insurance policies on Susan worth $1.5 million, and a handwritten letter from Susan expressing fear for her life. DNA test results, released in 2013, confirmed that one blood sample matched Susan's DNA, while another sample was identified as coming from an unknown male contributor. In August 2012, West Valley City Police released documents showing that Joshua's actions following Susan's disappearance were highly suspicious. He had liquidated Susan's retirement accounts, canceled her regular chiropractic appointments, and withdrew their children from daycare. He had also previously discussed with co-workers how to hide a body in an abandoned mineshaft in the western Utah desert. Police also interviewed the Powell's older son, Charlie, who confirmed that the camping trip Joshua had described did indeed take place. However, Charlie added that Susan had gone with them and did not return. Weeks later, a teacher reported that Charlie had said his mother was dead. Additionally, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, reported that several months after Susan's disappearance, Braden drew a picture of a van with 3 people in it and told his caregivers, "Mommy was in the trunk." In response to these developments, investigators informed the media that they planned to question Joshua again and subpoenaed all footage and interviews, both aired and unaired, of Joshua from local TV stations. On December 14, Joshua hired an attorney in connection with the investigation, and police noted that he had become increasingly uncooperative. A few days later, Joshua took his sons to Puyallup to stay with his father for the holidays. By December 24, Joshua was officially considered a person of interest by investigators. On January 6, 2010, Joshua returned with his brother Michael to pack up the family's belongings, indicating that he was planning to move permanently to Puyallup. Relations between the Powell and Cox families became increasingly hostile over time. After police raided their home in 2011, both Joshua and his father, Susan Powell, spoke to major news outlets about journals that Susan allegedly wrote about her relationship with Stephen. Stephen claimed that he and Susan had been falling in love before her disappearance, using the journals, written when Susan was a teenager, as evidence to suggest she was mentally unstable and might have run away with another man. In response, a judge issued a permanent injunction barring Joshua and Stephen from publishing any material from Susan's journals and ordered them to return or destroy any copies that had already been published. On September 22, 2011, Stephen was arrested on charges of voyeurism and child pornography after authorities discovered he had secretly videotaped young girls and several women, including Susan. Washington State's Assistant Attorney General, John Long, stated that Joshua was a subject in the investigation. A friend of Stephen's reported that he was fixated on pornography and was hung up on Susan sexually. The following day, Chuck Cox, Susan's father, filed for custody of her children. A Washington court granted Chuck temporary custody, ruling that Joshua would have to move out of Stephen's home to regain custody. Joshua rented a house in South Hill, though authorities later claimed that he never truly moved in there, instead pretending to comply with the court's orders while continuing to live with Stephen. In late September 2011, Jennifer Graves, Joshua's sister, publicly stated that she believed Joshua was responsible for his wife Susan Powell's disappearance. While Joshua's other sister, Alina, had initially suspected him as well, she later retracted her suspicions, feeling that Joshua had been unfairly harassed by investigators. By this time, West Valley City had spent more than $500,000 on the investigation. On September 28, Mayor Mike Winder expressed his belief that the case was still worth pursuing, saying that the evidence was beginning to add up and that they were at a critical point in the investigation. Later in 2011, Joshua underwent court-ordered evaluations in Washington, conducted by James Manley. The evaluation concluded that while Joshua had adequate parenting skills, a steady employment history, and no criminal background or history of domestic violence, there were concerns about his ongoing criminal investigations, refusal to acknowledge personal shortcomings, and controlling behavior toward his sons. Manley also noted Joshua's defensiveness and paranoia, linked to the police and media scrutiny, and suggested that Joshua be supervised during visits with his children. In the last week of January 2012, West Valley City Police discovered around 400 images of simulated child pornography, bestiality, and incest on a computer seized from the Powell home. The images had been cached when viewed by the previous owner of the computer, which Susan had bought second-hand. Although the images were not illegal due to their cartoonish 3D nature, they raised great concern for Manley, especially given Joshua's earlier denial of possessing such material. Manley recommended a more thorough psychosexual evaluation and polygraph test for Joshua, but suggested no changes to the visitation schedule with his children. At the same time, Joshua's brother, Michael, set up a Google Sites page accusing Susan's parents of abusing and neglecting the children with the help of child welfare authorities. He also claimed that West Valley City Police had mishandled the investigation into Susan's disappearance and were harassing Joshua. Lawyers for the Cox family contested these allegations, and the site was taken down by Google after a few days for violating its terms of use. On February 5, 2012, social worker Elizabeth Griffin Hall called 911 after a troubling incident during a supervised visit between Joshua and his sons, Charlie and Braden, at Joshua's house in South Hill. Hall, who was tasked with monitoring the visit, reported that Joshua grabbed his sons and prevented her from entering the house. Moments later, the house exploded, resulting in the deaths of Joshua and the two children. Local authorities treated the incident as a double murder-suicide, suggesting that the explosion was intentional. When authorities informed Stephen, who was in jail at the time, he appeared indifferent to the news and expressed anger towards the authorities who had notified him. 2 weeks later, Stephen invoked his Fifth Amendment right and refused to answer questions about Susan's disappearance. Chuck Cox and others believed that Stephen knew more about Susan's fate. In May 2012, Stephen was convicted on voyeurism charges, though the trial largely avoided addressing Susan's case. Following a brief investigation, officials confirmed that the explosion had been deliberately planned. The cause of death for Joshua and the two boys was determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning, although the coroner noted that both children had significant chopping injuries to their heads and necks. A hatchet was found near Joshua's body, leading investigators to believe he used it to attack his children before succumbing to the smoke and fumes. The fire investigation also uncovered 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline at the scene, along with evidence that gasoline had been spread throughout the house. Friends and relatives of Joshua told authorities that he had emailed them minutes before the explosion, saying goodbye. Some recipients, including his local bishop, were given instructions on how to access his finances and shut off his utilities. Records also revealed that Joshua had withdrawn $7,000 from his bank account and donated his children's toys and books to local charities the day before the incident. Additionally, Joshua had named his brother Michael as the primary beneficiary of his life insurance policy. Charles and Braden are buried at Woodbine Cemetery in Puyallup, Washington, where there is also a memorial for their mother, Susan. Joshua's remains were cremated. Today, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, continue to honor her memory and work tirelessly to raise awareness about domestic violence. They have dedicated themselves to advocating for victims of abuse, aiming to shed light on the signs of controlling relationships and the importance of early intervention. Through their advocacy efforts, they seek to educate others about the dangers of isolation, manipulation, and coercion that often accompany abusive relationships, hoping to prevent tragedies like Susan's from happening to others. In addition to speaking out about domestic violence, the Cox family has been involved in several initiatives aimed at supporting survivors and ensuring that people are more aware of the resources available to them. They have also focused on legislative change, pushing for stronger laws and better protections for victims of domestic abuse. Chuck and Judy's relentless pursuit of justice for Susan has inspired many, and their commitment to keeping Susan's story alive has made a lasting impact on both their community and the broader movement to combat domestic violence. The case of Susan Cox Powell serves as a sobering reminder of the red flags often present in abusive relationships, such as controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, and isolating tactics. It highlights the profound consequences of unchecked control and the devastating impact it can have on victims and their families. Through their ongoing work, Chuck and Judy Cox have turned their heartbreaking loss into a powerful platform for change, ensuring that Susan's memory and the lessons learned from her case will continue to resonate with future generations. Thank you for watching. If Susan's story moved you, please share it to spread awareness about the dangers of domestic violence. Together, we can honor her memory and help others before it's too late. Like, subscribe, and join us next time for more untold stories that need to be heard.